the college professors, everyone has demeaned the Crusades, never demeaning the Islamic violence that aroused the Crusades in the first place, right? That somehow gets forgotten. But sometimes you have to stand up and say, no, what they did was just, it was right, it was good, and it may happen again.
Hi guys, my name is Will, and today we are talking about the Crusades, and we are going to talk about the common lies that a lot of people spread about the Crusades, but we're also going to help correct the narrative, because the question is were the Crusades ever justified? Is violence ever a justifiable response for Christians? And with the cultural milieu as it is right now, this is a question that a lot of people have been asking. Are the Crusades justified? Should Christians ever be violent? And is there ever a time when it is incumbent upon someone to take up arms to fight against oppressors or anything like that? So today I'm joined by Dr. Pritchett with Trinity Radio, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about this.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Will. Being that Tim Stratton wasn't available, I'm the only masculine man that could actually swing a sword to show up to talk about this.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this video.
Let me destroy every lie you've been taught about the Crusades with historical facts they don't want you to know. From 632 to 1095 AD, Islamic armies conquered Christian lands from Spain to India. They took Syria, 634, Jerusalem, 638, Egypt, 639, North Africa, 698, and Spain, 711. 2/3 of Christendom gone. In conquered lands, Christians faced the triple choice: convert, submit and pay crushing taxes, or die. Then came the Seljuk Turks. They didn't just conquer, they butchered. Christian pilgrims were tortured, robbed, and murdered on the roads to Jerusalem. Byzantine Emperor Alexios sent desperate letters west. They destroy our altars after defiling them with their uncleanness. They circumcise Christians, and the blood from the circumcision they pour on the altars or throw into the baptismal font. Pope Urban II's response launched the First Crusade with 2 words: Deus vult, God wills it. Here's what your professor hides. The Crusaders weren't conquerors, they were liberators. Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler of Jerusalem, sold everything he owned to go fight. He refused the title king, saying no man should wear a crown of gold where Christ wore thorns. Raymond of Toulouse spent 400,000 silver marks, his entire fortune, to fund the crusade. These weren't treasure hunters. They were men who understood that some things matter more than life. The Crusades worked. They broke Islamic expansion for 200 years. Without them, there's no Renaissance, no Reformation, no scientific revolution. The University of Paris becomes a madrasa. Aquinas never writes. Dante never poets. Western civilization ends in the 11th century. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. Psalm 144, verse 1. Every Crusader knight prayed this before battle. They knew what modern Christians deny. Sometimes love requires a sword. But we've been taught to be ashamed of men who saved our civilization. And now, having forgot what they fought for, we're losing it without firing a single shot.
So that was essentially him making a quick case as to why the Crusades were actually a good thing. And here's my thing. I actually do agree with that. If we look at history, we know that 2/3 of the Christian world was actually being lost by Muslim expansion, and they were extremely violent, and that's exactly what they would do. They either you convert, you die, or we're going to tax you to death we're at the point where you can't afford anything. You're going to starve to death anyway. So at some point in time, after 400 years, essentially that from 600 AD to about when the Crusades started, 1095, you have about a 400 or 500 year period there where the Muslim armies were just expanding violently across the entire known world at the time. So now you have Christians who actually respond in violence. And nowadays I've been hearing a lot of people basically be like, well, Christians can't ever do that. Like, Christians can't ever respond in violence. And I'm not sure if I fully agree with that. What are your thoughts, Pritchett?
I absolutely do not fully agree with that because I mentioned Tim Stratton in the opener. Tim Stratton and I have both been doing podcasts, and he's been doing several series of articles defending not just war, but even violence in personal self-defense or defense of others when it's justified within whatever laws of particular states. And some states are better than others. And you get a lot of pushback from Christians about self-defense. I mean, John Piper famously said, even if someone breaks into your house and is going to attack you and your wife, you almost have an obligation to die. And for most Christians, you just know that that's absolute nonsense. That's a failure to do your duty as a husband, to protect your wife, your family. And beyond that, the state does have a duty to respond to hordes of violence that are encroaching into your lands.
Right.
And so the power to do that is with the state. And when people are being unjustly killed, the state must justly go to war to combat that.
And right. And a lot of people don't realize that back then, the whole idea of separation of church and state, because you'll get a lot, obviously the Crusades, as they went on, they became more political. And we've talked about that before, where yes, when it becomes a complete, basically facade to push your political agenda, that's a different thing. But when it first started, really was this response, and they didn't have separation of church and state the way we have it today. So that's why people oftentimes get confused when they see the church responding in that way as well. But the government and the church were also kind of working in tandem with each other. That's just kind of the way it was back then.
Yeah, you can't retcon our sensibilities about American government and whatever you make about the separation of church and state. There's a whole debate about that because that's not technically in the Constitution.
Right.
But you can't anachronistically judge prior governments and nations by the same standards that we are judging ourselves today. So, again, I understand modern sensibilities may take offense to government sanctioning war under religious pretense, but it's also the geopolitical with religious trappings of Islam waging war, and you have to respond to it because they want you to convert, pay tax, or die, and you want to live in your homeland with safety and without the hordes invading. So we can say that the later Crusades might have been, less necessary as the earlier ones, but certainly I think the consensus has changed. And it's never popular to defend violent wars of the past, right? Especially if it's got religious overtones. But I remember, you're probably not old enough to remember this, but Veterans Day of 1988, Reagan was able to get out there and say that, no, the Vietnam War was a just cause. It was a noble cause. And that was, 10 to 12 years after the war ended. It was not that popular to say that. But men of courage will often speak out, and you see more and more men of courage speaking out in defense of the Crusades, especially the earlier ones.
Right. Well, and it goes back into when people talk about Christian violence and they just think violence itself is objectively wrong. But violence has a context, right? If I am being unnecessarily violent or cruelly violent, then that's an improper context. But if I'm being violent to someone who is maybe a murderer who's trying to murder a person's family, then I'm committing violence that is in the face of justice, right? So violence itself is kind of amoral, and I think that sometimes people kind of get that mixed up. But I mean, no one denies the fact that the Allied powers had to do something during World War II. That the German armies and the German forces were not only encroaching into Europe, but also oppressing, of course, the Jewish people famously and all these other things during the Holocaust. So when you have that sort of backdrop, people go, yeah, that's a very justified war. I see why we did that. And I think that was a good thing. Well, take your glasses on for a second and look at the same time period with the Crusades, and I think you'll start seeing your answer. Because if Christian men don't stand up and don't defend their own physically, then what are you even doing as a man when your family or your nation really desperately needs your protection? Are you just going to stand on the sidelines and let everyone die? You know what I mean?
Well, I'm certainly not, but far too many Christians have been misled by misunderstanding various proof texts, misunderstanding the biblical narrative of Jesus' mission and what he said within that context. I've noticed that very few people understand what Jesus was actually talking about when he said, turn the other cheek in the Sermon on the Mount, like in Matthew 5, within the same context of if someone forces you to go a mile, you go two, and if they want to sue you for your shirt, give them your cloak as well. Mm-hmm. Things like that. Turn the other cheek is basically a slap of humiliation to shame you in front of other people. It's not like a physical assault that the man's trying to beat you up. The go the extra mile, as where the saying comes from English translations. Roman soldiers could, Angria, they could conscript people in occupied lands to carry their gear for them. They just pick you off the street and say, I want you to carry this stuff. but it could only go for a certain distance. And Jesus was saying, because that's the only context by which anyone ever, people are like, why would someone make you walk a mile? What's that? Well, it comes from Roman soldiers doing that to the people that they occupied, making them carry their gear. And Jesus is saying you can actually win favor with them by going even further than they're allowed to legally make you go. And that way you can, do evangelism and win them over and make them even feel a little bit of shame for having got you to do it in the first place. It's little things like don't go to court over trivial matters. Like just give them what they want. Don't occupy yourself. Go to court. Eye for an eye, and you're going to get run into the courts over a little slap. None of that has to do with being physically assaulted.
Right. No, exactly. It's not the same context as nowadays.
Right. So this idea that Christians are supposed to lay down. No, you don't have to. You don't have to take a beating, or you don't have to watch someone else take a beating and just be one of those people filming it with your phone. You can actually go and help people.
Right. So when you hear the people say that, they're obviously going to point those who disagree to what Jesus did, where he laid his life down. He didn't fight back. He didn't call forth 12,000 angels to come take him off the cross. What would be our general response then to that? Because it seems like to me that Christ was actually going for a mission, and his mission was to conquer sin, death, and the devil at the cross, not necessarily to conquer at that time. But we do see that Christ is going to return and judge the living and the dead. So he is going to be the sword, right? He is going to be a sword, but just not at that given time. What do you think about all that?
Well, I think that in the same chapter in Luke, it's sell your cloak and buy some swords. And in that same chapter, Jesus is telling them to not draw their swords, right? Because Jesus had a purpose and a mission, like you said. But also, Jesus isn't stupid. If they like when Peter's taking out his sword, he wants to chop off the high priest's servant's ear. It also says in that chapter, all those men, the crowd had clubs and swords. So obviously, you're going to lose that fight. So not only did Jesus have a purpose, but Jesus also didn't want his disciples to just get needlessly slaughtered trying to, Peter's the man. I like him. He's, really just brutal. And he's like, I'm ready to go, but Jesus is like, no, you put that away. And chances are if Jesus hadn't healed the ear, they probably would have killed him. So
no, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's not like don't ever use a sword, just don't use it now. And I know it's weird because Jesus says if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. People turn that into some cosmic, universal, ironclad law of the universe. But we know that that's not what it is. People try to do that with the book of Proverbs. They expect those to be promises instead of just general wisdom. And what Jesus is basically saying is, put your sword up because you're about to get your butt kicked. That's really what he's saying.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It's not some sort of profound cosmic statement about anyone who's ever used any weapon will die by that weapon, because we know that doesn't happen.
Right, because if you even go to your Old Testament, you'll see holy war essentially being done against the Canaanites, the Amalekites, and others, where these horrible pagans were occupying this land and actually were a great threat to Israel. So God told them, drive them out of the land, right? So it's not our God. I look at the scripture and I don't see God as pacifist. I see God as telling his men to equip themselves and fight for that which is good when necessary, and not needless violence, nothing like that, but being controlled and measured strength under control, so to speak.
Yeah, Paul says to imitate me as I imitate Christ, and we're supposed to imitate Christ as well. But when you think about who Christ is, if you're a proper Trinitarian like you should be, and not a heretic, Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. Okay. So we have two testaments that can help inform our Christian view of just war, what is proper self-defense. I mean, even Exodus 22 has got some weird comments about, well, if it's in the nighttime and they break into your house, you can kill them. You just can't kill them during the daytime or whatever. I don't know, it's weird. But we have two testaments that help us understand who Christ is, and that's the same Christ that's coming back, like you said, with a sword coming out of his mouth and going to judge people. So let's be careful about when you say imitate Christ. Which Christ? The one that flips tables, or
or the one that says, he without sin cast the first stone. Like right. There's more to it than that.
Right.
So
one-dimensional Jesus have no use for a one-dimensional Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other things is that Christian pacifism comes up and it says you can't do violence or anything, but there is a level of hypocrisy that oftentimes comes with that, because everything comes by force. All our laws are enforced by force, right? Like if I break the law and if I don't, I could be arrested. I could go to court. I could be, who knows? There is always something that is enforced by force, right? It is not something that's just passive, like, hey, we're just going to ask you to do this. No, there will be consequences if I break it. So even if someone is pacifist and someone's trying to break into the home, for example, or is attacking the people, they're going to call the police. So therefore they are going to instead depend on someone else's violence and that someone else's weaponry rather than stepping to defend it themselves. So that's why I think in many ways that there's the principles that within the Crusades are telling us that there is a level that can be good where people stand up, because again, all of Western civilization would have been destroyed before it even had a time to blossom, really. And if the Crusades were kept going, if the Muslim expansion was going the way it was going to go and the way it was going before the Crusades took place.
Well, let me steel man the pacifist for a second.
Yes.
So there's a spectrum, right? Because some pacifists could answer, yes, of course we're going to rely on other people's violence because the police are state action, right? But then there are other pacifists who would just lay down, right? Because they don't want even that violence. And both sets of pacifists would never participate in state violence, so they would never be police officers or military or whatever. But some of the pacifists, you're right, they are going to allow the state to do the violence for them.
Right. And that's the problem.
But the state also, as in a place like the United States of America that recognizes natural law, the state also recognizes that you are the government of the people, by the people, for the people. And so the government itself gives laws. We have self-defense laws. We have castle doctrine laws. We have stand your ground laws. So the state itself gives you permission. So there is no distinction between you able to do some functions that the police would do if they had to draw fire, or you can let them do it, but the law allows for both to occur in specific circumstances.
Right, absolutely. So anyway, these are my current thoughts on the Crusades. Jonathan, do you have anything real quick to say before we wrap up the video?
Yes, I think sometimes you have to stand up and take the unpopular position, like I mentioned Ronald Reagan taking the unpopular position about the Vietnam War, the communism that was going on there, and he thought that was a noble effort when it was probably the most unpopular war in U.S. history, And the Crusades, like the speaker was saying in the video, the college professors, everyone has demeaned the Crusades, never demeaning the Islamic violence that aroused the Crusades in the first place, right? That somehow gets forgotten. But sometimes you have to stand up and say, no, what they did was just, it was right, it was good, and it may happen again.
Right. Well, that's exactly it. And that's why we need to be, as Christian men, we need to be vigilant. We need to pay attention. And we need to make sure that we understand what our true Christian principles teach and what Christ was saying, what he wasn't saying, and then learn how to operate from there. It's very important that we do that. So anyway, to all of you, what do you think of the Crusades? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you next time on The Church Split.